Hi, and welcome to this video where we're going to talk about multi-line statements and multi-line strings. So a Python program is nothing more than basically a text file, right? A text document that contains physical lines of code, and you write your code over multiple lines. You use the enter key on your keyboard to move to a new line, right? So we call that a physical new line. Now that code is then passed by the Python compiler, and it then combines certain lines and makes up logical lines of code. And your logical lines of code are then tokenized so that the Python compiler and the interpreter can, basically interpret what your code is trying to do and actually execute that on the computer. So physical lines of code will end with a physical new line character, and logical lines of code, once they've been tokenized and passed and so on, will end with a new line token. So how that gets done and so on isn't really important. But what's important is that we have to realize that there's a difference between a physical new line character and a logical new line token. They're not necessarily the same thing. Very often they are, but not always. So sometimes physical new lines are ignored. And they're ignored in order to combine multiple physical lines into a single logical line of code, which is then terminated by the logical new line token. And that's what allows us to write code, over multiple lines that technically should be written as a single line, right? We can actually write it over multiple lines. And why would we do that? It's really for readability, right? It allows us to make our code more easy to read. And that's really, really important because the compiler, the interpreter really doesn't care, whether you write it over one line, over two lines. At the end of the day, it's going to recombine lines into single lines as needed. It's going to tokenize everything. It doesn't care about human readability. But as developers, we need to care about human readability because we are reading our code. Other people might be reading our code. Or you might even be reading your code 6 months later and trying to figure out, what was I doing? So it's really important to make code readable. It's important to put comments. It's important to format things nicely. And this allows us to do that. So this conversion between physical and logical new lines, right? This removal of physical new line characters is done either implicitly or explicitly. Implicitly in some cases, and in other cases we have to do explicit line breaks. So let's take a look at the implicit first. So for implicit, really we can use it in things like expressions which are like list literals, right, that start and end with square brackets, tuples with the round parentheses, dictionaries that use the curly braces, and sets that also use curly braces. And as I said before, it kind of makes sense because dictionaries and sets are very, very tightly related. And then also function arguments and parameters can also be split over multiple lines. And they also support inline comments. So let's take a look at how this works. So for example, for this list over here, 1, 2, 3, you don't have to write it over a single line. You could actually break it up over multiple lines. And these physical new lines will be implicitly removed by Python. Now in this case, it doesn't make much sense to write this list this way, but suppose that these were like long strings. Then it would make more sense maybe to break it out over multiple lines so it's easier to read. Or maybe you have a nested structure where you have dictionaries that contain lists, that contain dictionaries that are very typical of things like JSON objects, for example. Then you probably will want to break that over multiple lines and do nice indenting so it's easy to understand and read that particular object. You can also include inline comments. So at the end of every line after before your physical new line character, you can insert a comment that will be stripped out by Python. So this is perfectly legal to do. Same thing with functions. You don't have to write all your parameters over a single line. You may write it over multiple lines. And again, it's for readability. You can even comment, let's say, certain parameters if you want this way. And then when you call the function, well, you can do the same thing. You can break up your arguments over multiple lines. You can even insert comments, right, within, before you do your new line character. So remember that what happens at the end of the day is that this comment is stripped out and this new line and this new line are stripped out, and you end up with def myfunc a comma b comma c, as if you had written that. Okay, that's how Python is going to basically combine these different physical lines into a single logical line. And the same thing happens here. This comment here is going to get stripped out, the new line character over here is going to get stripped out, and this is going to become myfunc 10 comma 20 comma 30. So this is where implicit works. Now, there are sometimes cases where we have long statements and we want to break those up over multiple physical lines as well. But Python will not do implicit removal of your new line characters in that case. You have to explicitly specify that I'm doing a continuation of the code. And you do that by using this continuation character, the / character. So multiple line statements are not implicitly converted, okay, into a single logical line. Keep that in mind. So you have to use the /. So for example, if you want to break up an if statement that has multiple ands and ors, and it gets really complicated, and it might make more sense to break it out over multiple lines in order to understand what's happening, what that piece of code is doing. Again, readability. This won't work. You cannot do that, right? If Python's going to look at this, it's going to put the new line token here, it's going to say, well, this is invalid. Doesn't work, right? Because it didn't find the colon. So instead, what you can do is you can do an explicit line continuation using this / character, and this will work just fine. Now, the one thing is you cannot put in comments after these, backslashes or even before them. You have to put it, if you want to put a comment, you're going to have to put it either above, below, or you can put it right after the colon as well. That's fine. But you cannot make a comment part of a statement, being inside a statement, not even a multi-line statement. So that won't work. So this, for example, is not legal. That won't work. All right, the next thing we need to look at are multi-string literals. So we can also create strings that span multiple lines in our physical, code. And we do that by using triple delimiters. Whether you're using single or double quote delimiters doesn't matter. You just triple them up. So instead of using a single quote or a single double quote to delimit the string on either end, you use triple. And that then allows you to write strings over multiple lines, over multiple physical lines, as in this example. So we have a triple single quote. This is, got a new line, we hit the enter key here, and a multi-line string continues, and then we end the string. And you can do the same thing using double quotes, so whatever you want to use. Now, you have to really be aware that this works a little differently than the implicit, for example, continuation that we had with lists, where it was stripping out the new line character. Here, Python is not going to strip out the new line character. So when you print the string out, it will retain this new line character. In fact, it will retain any character that you've typed into that string, whether it be a new line, whether it be a tab, whether it be a Unicode character, or some hidden, character that doesn't print, but it's still there, right? So anything you type is going to be in that string, including multiple spaces and things like that. And so it's important, if you're trying to get a string that's formatted for display, you want to be sure that you don't type extra characters that allows you to line things up in your code, but then doesn't line up when you print. And we'll see examples of that throughout this course. So these are just regular strings, so you can use escape characters if you want, like \n, \t. You can use string formatting, you can apply the format method, you can do all that stuff. They're just normal strings. They're no different. So multi-line string is just a regular string. The only difference is that you can have that string, content, that literal, span multiple lines. Now, one thing I want to point out is that multi-line strings are not the same thing as comments. Now, they can be used as comments, especially with things with, that we call doc strings that we'll look at in a lot more detail in the object-oriented section. But strings and comments are not the same thing. So yes, you can put strings inside your code that are not assigned to a variable, that are just sitting there in your code. That's perfectly fine. And you can use that for doc strings, for documentation. But these are not comments. They're not the same thing. So when Python compiles your code, those strings will be part of your code. They'll be compiled and they'll be put into your compiled bytecode. However, comments are tossed out. They're not. So they're different things, not the same. All right, so let's switch to some code and take a look at how all of this works. So we're going to start with a list. Now, a list can be written over one line, let's say something like that. But sometimes you may want to write it over multiple lines, in which case we can do something like this. And you don't have to put one item per line. You can put how many, however many you want. And we'll still get a regular list. Nothing has changed. It's just implicit line continuation. Now, you can also add comments. So let's say we say 1, and let's call it item 1. Now, you have to be careful where you place the comma to separate your items. Because if you put a comma here, then this comma is part of the comment, which means that it's not going to be a valid Python statement. So if we do 2 here and we try and run this, we get an invalid syntax error. Well, yeah, because there's no comma between the two. But there is a new line. Right? So instead, what we would have to do to fix that, there's one of 2 solutions. First one is to put the comma right after the element, but before the comment. That's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is just to put the comma before the next element. And you can do that as well. And in both cases, it will do the same thing. And if we look at the contents of A, you'll notice it's just 1, 2. The comment was ignored. Okay, now this works the same way for, tuples. So A equals 1, 2, 3. We can put a comment here. We can put a comment here. We can put as many comments as we want. And we just get a regular tuple. Nothing different there. Same thing with sets, which I won't show you. It's the same thing. And dictionaries as well. I will show you that one very quickly. So let's say we have a key value like so. Let's make it a value of 1. We can add a comment, right? So we can say this is value for key 1. And again, where we place the comma is important, either here or at the beginning of the next item. I'll put it at the beginning of the next item. Key 2, value for key 2. Now, we have to be careful here as well, because you'll notice that I have a comment on the last line, which means that that closing brace over here is actually part of the comment. So if I try and run that, I'll get a syntax error, right? So we have to fix that by putting it on its own line, right? We have to do it that way. And now that will work and we get a regular dictionary, okay? Now you can do the same thing when you have a function. So let's look def my func. We can certainly put a comma b comma c in this fashion, right? But maybe I want to break it up. Maybe I've got lots of parameters in the function, or I've got long names, or maybe there's some other reason why I want to break it up. And in this case, I'm going to break it up, let's say this way, right? So we've broken up the function this way, and we can add a comment. Right? We can say this is used to indicate blah, 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 and another comment here, right? Now, again, you got to be careful about the placement of your commas. Don't place them after the comment, otherwise they'll be part of the comment and ignored, and you'll have a syntax error. Okay, so we can start with that, and then we can just say, print a comma b comma c. So this function will just print whatever was passed in. Now when we call the function, we can do the same thing. We can call function with, let's say, 10, 20, 30. Okay, that works just fine. But we can also call it by splitting the values over multiple lines. That's fine as well. And again, that's fairly useful when you're dealing with functions that take in a lot of parameters, and maybe the parameter names are long. Maybe it's something that allows you to connect to a database, so you need to specify the database, the server, the database, maybe the table, maybe the query that you're trying to run. So very often, you end up writing function calls over multiple lines, probably more often than you do writing the function headers themselves. So in this case, we could do something like this. Func 10, and, comment here that describes maybe what the value is. 20, another comment, 30, another comment, and again we have to be careful not to make that closing parentheses part of the comment itself, and this works just as before, nothing different. Okay, so that's kind of the line continuation, the implicit line continuation. Now let's take a look at explicit line continuation. So let's say if we have A equals 10, B equals 20, C equals 30. Let's say we have these three variables and we write an if statement. And we say if A is greater than 5 and B is greater than 10 and C is greater than 20, which is going to be true in this particular case, then we can print yes. Okay, so that works just fine. Now, sometimes your expressions here might become very long, or it could be other statements too. It's not just an if statement. But maybe the line just becomes too long, and it is preferred in Python to keep your line length under a certain number of characters to make it more readable on a variety of screen resolutions and screen sizes. So part of some of the best practices in Python, which we'll talk about later actually, it's called a PEP 8, and we'll take a look at that in an upcoming video. So let's change this and let's put in line continuations. Let's say that I want to have each expression, each sub-expression, those comparisons on different lines. Then I can do a line continuation character essentially using a backslash. Okay, and then we do another one here, and there we go, we're over 3 lines. Now the indentation actually doesn't matter at this point, because remember, it doesn't matter how you indent your code here, because those new lines are going to get removed and it's going to become a single line. So in this case, I'm going to choose to indent it maybe this way. And that's perfectly fine too. And as you can see, it ran fine. So the line continuation character is just something you can put in wherever you want to break a physical line or a logical line into 2 physical lines or more physical lines. The next one are multi-line strings. Now, multi-line strings are done with triple delimiters. So here I have 3 single quotes followed by 3 single quotes. That's the ending and closing quotes. And we can type something in there. This is a string. Okay, and if we print out A, this is a string. It's still a string. So the triple delimiter just is a regular string. But what's different about the triple delimiter is that we can split it over multiple lines, as in this case, and you'll see the result is this \n, right? And this is why I just wanted to print it out this way, is a string. So that new line character was preserved. So if we print it for display, let's say from the program, we would actually get it over 2 lines. Now, what's important to realize is that anything you type in here, so if we do something like this, A equals triple quote, so now we have a multi-line. This is a string. And let's say I put in a few extra spaces, and maybe I'll put in an extra carriage return here. I'll indent it some more. This is a string that is created over multiple lines. So now if we look at A, you'll notice that we have those carriage returns and those spaces are there as well. So if we print A, then we get exactly what we typed over here. So that's kind of important to remember, because if you're trying to, let's say, define a multi-line string to create some text that you want to display to a user, let's say on the console, then if you try and line things up so that the string looks good in your code, it may actually not look good in the actual console. For example, if we do something like this, A equals, let's say, some items, and I'm trying to, line it up here as my list. So I'll go 1, item 1, 2, item 2. Okay, it looks good in the code, but if you print it, then it doesn't look that great, right? It was indented over here a lot more than I had, right? Because this seemed to line up with just one character difference, right, between this line and these items, and this no longer does. So just something to be aware of, okay? Now in particular, let's look at it this way. So we have def myfunc, and so now we have indentation already, right? We're using a equals, that's indented inside the function. And if we do a multi-line string and say a multi-line string, I hit enter, that is, now the program automatically shifts my line of code to the proper indentation, and most of the Python IDEs will do that as well. So a multi-line string that is indented in the second line, and it will just, this function will just return that string. Okay, so there we go. Now if we print myfunc called, then you'll notice what happened. That is indented in the second line was actually indented. Because why? Well, this entire thing here is the string, which means it includes that indentation that was put in automatically for us. So in a case like this, you've got to be careful. You have to really unindent it if you want it to be not indented in the display. So it looks weird. It looks like you're breaking, the indentation, but you're not. That's because remember that this is basically, a line continuation. This is a single entity right here. This is a single string literal. And so whatever's inside, it doesn't matter if it's indented or not. So in this case, if we do this and now we print it, now we get maybe something more like we would have expected. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.